Well, good afternoon. I'm John Sefrin, CEO of the American Cancer Society, and it's indeed an honor to be here to help launch the Tobacco Atlas 5th edition, which is the output of a wonderful collaboration and partnership between the American Cancer Society and the World Lung Foundation. This document is the most comprehensive and compelling resource of tobacco control information available in the world. Basically, there's nothing else quite like it. This is one of those rare times when you can say something that's accurate, and that is it's unique. Even Bill Gates, in a press conference, held it up and said, this is the Bible in terms of cancer control. As you peruse it, one thing will be remarkably clear. The tobacco pandemic is far from under control. Indeed, I believe it to be the greatest single public health challenge of this century. Nothing will trump controlling tobacco with respect to improving health. We have made, having said all of that, we have made progress against tobacco in many parts of the world. In my own country, the United States of America, we've seen adult prevalence rates declining from over 40% in the 1960s to less than 20% today. So we have learned over the years how to intervene. The Tobacco Atlas, importantly, is not only a rich data source, and it is certainly that, but it offers solutions for controlling tobacco use worldwide, sharing what we've learned over the many years in fighting this pandemic. It includes products and their use, economic costs, and it even reveals the shameful tactics of the industry. Bottom line is that things are happening all over the world, and we know that things that are learned in one part of the world can often be used in another part of the world to help solve the problem. By the way, this is a resource in multiple languages. So I'm holding up the one in the Arabic language, which is available in the hall today and across the way at the American Cancer Society booth in the exhibit, if you don't already have one. But later this year, it will also be available in French, Mandarin, and Spanish. And of course, these are free to all of you, and we encourage you to use them. Finally, the Atlas also emphasizes that we will not win this fight against tobacco alone. We have to understand we can't so go it alone. The tobacco control community must reach out to all types of organizations and sectors to finish this fight. So whether your work focuses on a non-communicable disease like mine does on cancer, or on equality, or development, or the environment, we need you to help in this global fight. Now, please keep in mind during the presentations today that our session will not end without having a session moderated for questions and answers. And there'll be someone at literally every row and aisle. So if you have a question you want to write down, please do submit it for our panelists. In addition, you can tweet your question using the hashtag Tobacco Atlas. And you can also tweet some of the lessons you're learning during this session, because you're going to hear from the authors of this document who have a wealth of information to share. Not the least of which is the next speaker. It is my privilege now to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Jeffrey Drope, who is the Managing Director of Economic and Health Policy Research for my own organization, the American Cancer Society, and he's also one of the authors of the Tobacco Atlas. Jeff?
Thank you, Dr. Sefrin, and thank you to all of you for coming out today and for being here at the World Conference to carry on our fight against the tobacco epidemic. On one hand, it feels slightly ridiculous to me to be up here talking to all of you, this esteemed tobacco control audience, about the harms of tobacco. On the other hand, these harms are so mind-boggling, and it would seem so enduring that I do believe it's worth repeating. As the infamous but ruthlessly accurate death clock behind me suggests, the human toll has been staggering and continues to be. For those not familiar with the FCA's very powerful death clock image, it is the number of people who have died since the beginning of FCTC negotiations in 1999. More than 1 billion tobacco users continue in the world today, of whom more than half and perhaps as many as 2/3 will die from their addiction. So, as you can see, it is a very bleak scenario still. In the Atlas, we make the case that we need to think about these harms in a very holistic and broad context. So let's begin perhaps with the most obvious, the human body. tobacco harms the entire body. First, we have the 4 leading non-communicable diseases of which tobacco use is a major risk factor. Next, we consider the diseases associated with the Atlas's 2 sponsors, cancers and diseases of the respiratory system. Sadly, we could have pretty much every other major health organization up on the dais with us today because tobacco affects every major organ system and every appendage. And the frightening thing is, we keep finding new relationships, negative relationships. Just last month, American Cancer Society researchers published an article that illuminated strong connections between tobacco use and a number of other diseases that we didn't previously think had a strong link. For example, renal failure and intestinal ischemia both appear to have very strong links to tobacco use. We don't know the precise mechanisms yet, but of course, as a research community, we will find out very quickly. In terms of economic costs, we're still tallying the harm. More conservative estimates place the costs at over $1 trillion US per year. Recent research that in fact actually factors in lost productivity and other variables more systematically suggests that it may be over $2.1 trillion in economic impact. While a precise estimate is challenging, the magnitude of even the lowest estimates dwarf the tobacco industry's own claims about what their economic contribution to the world economy is. Finally, we'll move to environmental harm of tobacco. Did you know that tobacco cigarette butts are the most discarded piece of rubbish in the entire world? Think about that. The world consumed nearly 6 trillion cigarettes last year, and those cigarette butts actually have to go somewhere. That is 1.7 billion pounds of toxic trash each year. Or, to put it another way, 166,000 African elephants. That's the world's largest land mammal. The damage to our cultivable land from growing tobacco leaf is also overwhelming. It is a crop that typically requires large amounts of fertilizer, herbicide, water. As global demand for products has continued in the last 30 years, the tobacco industry has looked for new places to get their leaf supply. 30 years ago, Malawi was only a small tobacco producer. It is now the #1 burley tobacco producer in the world. Let's take a look at changes in Kasungu district in Malawi, where verdant forests and food crops first gave way to intensive tobacco cultivation. Now there's massive vegetation loss. Farmers have abandoned their old tobacco fields because of low prices for tobacco, prices driven by the tobacco industry, and also use curing practices that are very timber intensive. Now, to discuss briefly tobacco's strong connections to other important global issues, particularly comorbidities in our shared fight against non-communicable disease, I introduce my colleague, Dr. Neil Schluger, the Chief Scientific Officer of the World Lung Foundation.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to make a few brief comments about one of the major themes of the conference, the link between tobacco and non-communicable diseases, and I'll go beyond that to talk about some communicable diseases as well. But the link between tobacco and non-communicable diseases is really, as I mentioned, one of the main themes of the conference, and you can see here on this slide that of all the major drivers of these non-communicable diseases, tobacco is certainly the most important, being a major contributor to development of heart disease, stroke, cancer, diabetes, chronic lung disease, so that the total number of deaths that are driven by tobacco exceeds 6 million around the world every year, and that's many more than all of the other contributors to the common chronic non-communicable diseases, physical inactivity, alcohol use, or high salt diets. Those are all important drivers of disease, but none of them really match the damage that's done by tobacco around the world. Now, we all in this room, I think, know that, but one of the interesting things to realize is that around the world there's a tremendous lack of awareness about the damage that tobacco does, a lack of understanding that smoking directly is a major cause of lung cancer, heart attack, and stroke, and furthermore a lack of awareness that secondhand smoke has also been well established to contribute to the the toll that's caused by lung cancer and heart disease. And so that's a major job that all of us have to do, and that the Atlas will help you do, to increase awareness among all the users of tobacco and all those who are affected by those who live with people who use tobacco, to really increase awareness about the damage that tobacco does. As I said, we all know this, but as you can see from the slide here, millions of people around the world don't know this, and that's an important message for you to bring home, and an important job that all of us have to do when we go home to increase awareness. Now, the major non-communicable diseases have been mentioned by Jeff and many of the other speakers at the conference, but I want to focus attention on one additional non-communicable disease and one communicable disease where tobacco plays an important role. Mental illness is one disease where the relationship between tobacco and mental illness is very complex, but what we do know is that people with mental illness, which is a category of disease that affects millions and millions and millions of people around the world, the interplay between mental illness and tobacco use seems very profound. On the slide in front of you now, what you see are circles that represent people with either no mental illness or 1, 2, or 3 different diagnoses of mental illness, anxiety, depression, and things like that. The darker shading on each of those circles indicates the number of people who are smokers who have that number of diseases. So you can see people with more and more mental illness are more likely to smoke, and this makes the treatment of mental illness much, much, much more complicated. And there's no question that the tobacco infinitely complicates the treatment, diagnosis, and management of patients with mental illness. So again, we often don't think of mental illness in the same category as other NCDs that are affected by tobacco, but I think there's a very complicated and important interplay between them that we really shouldn't ignore. And finally, although it's not a non-communicable disease, tuberculosis is a very communicable disease. I want to remind you that tuberculosis remains one of the 10 leading causes of death in the world. Deaths from tuberculosis are decreasing very slowly around the world. About 1.5 million people die each year from tuberculosis. And we know from a great deal of research that's been done over the last 10 years or so that tobacco use contributes very strongly to the development of tuberculosis in people who've been exposed to that infection. And so tobacco use around the world is retarding progress toward the elimination of TB to an enormous extent. You can see here that the tuberculosis Millennium Development Goals for various regions around the world are being delayed by decades because of ongoing tobacco use. And in certain regions, such as Africa, with tobacco use at the rate it's seen now, the tuberculosis Millennium Development Goals will never be reached. As I mentioned, delays in reaching the tuberculosis Millennium Development Goals in every region, almost to infinite proportions. And so finally, our message this morning is that we think that by engaging a wide range of health, legal, economic, development, and environmental advocates and proponents, and demonstrating how tobacco use affects those issues, we really can amplify our impact, and that's the message of the Tobacco Atlas that we want to bring to you today. So with that, I'll turn the program over to my colleague Alex Lieber from the American Cancer Society. Alex has been a contributing author and researcher to the Atlas, and I'm happy to turn the podium over to him.
Good morning. So I'm going to talk about one of the new chapters in the 5th edition of the Tobacco Atlas, which is about water pipe smoking. And that has been a big focus of this conference because, as we know, water pipe smoking is very important and is seemingly embedded in the fabric of the Middle East. But I'm going to challenge part of that conception today. So water pipe tobacco smoking goes by many names, including hookah, shisha, nargila, gailan, and hubble bubble. Water pipe smoking has deep roots here in the Middle East, but also in India and Africa. And epidemiologists are early in their studies compared to cigarette smoking into the harms of water pipe use, but it has been linked to lung, lip, and mouth cancer. And we anticipate that more diseases will be linked in the future, just as we are finding today with cigarette smoking. It's still producing more unknown causes of disease. The use of water pipe has boomed since the introduction of Moselle tobacco in the early 1990s. Now, if you haven't heard the term Moselle yet, it is the molasses-soaked, candy-flavored smoking tobacco used in almost all water pipes around the world today, and pictured here, it's that sticky, sweet brown stuff. The data points to the introduction of Moselle being a real disruption in the water pipe tobacco market. And what I mean by that is that whereas water pipe smoking was traditionally the domain of older men in the Middle East, when Moselle came on the scene, it came into new markets made up of young people and women, and I think the reason that this happened is that it is sticky, sweet, and different than traditional water pipe tobacco that was without flavor. This figure plotting the year of smoking initiation of water pipe users in a cafe in Aleppo, Syria from around 2002 is instructive. Almost all the tobacco users in that single cafe started using water pipe after Moselle was introduced in 1990, even though water pipe had been in Syria for generations before. I'd like to say that Moselle is just misinformation about the harms of water pipe smoking soaked in sugary candy flavors. See the 0% tar label on a pack of delicious smelling peach flavored Moselle that I bought around the corner from American Cancer Society headquarters in Atlanta. It claims that there's no tar. It's incredibly deceptive. And lest you think that flavored water pipe is a tiny anomaly like candy flavored cigarettes, I am sorry to say that flavored Moselle is the norm, as more than 9 in 10 water pipe tobacco users today are smoking flavored Moselle. The tobacco companies sell flavors like double apple, blueberry and vanilla ice cream, watermelon, cherry, and hundreds others, all shown here. And this is just from a single website I collected all these images. These flavors are not meant to appeal to older men. They are meant to appeal to children, young students, and women. The sweet-tasting smoke Moselle produces when heated by a lit charcoal is often perceived to be harmless by water pipe users and bystanders. And a long-standing myth about water pipe smoking is that the smoke is magically filtered of toxins by the water in the pipe's base. The tobacco industry is well aware that water pipe smoke contains the same deadly chemicals as cigarette smoke. Even in 1967, industry documents confirmed that British-American tobacco scientists were well aware that water made a poor filter for tobacco smoke. And in surveys, women, more often than men, as well as young people, more often than their elders, are more likely to attribute the rising prevalence of water pipe around the world to the popularity of Moselle. This finding begs us to establish whether Moselle is the main reason why women and young people around the world use water pipe. And the answer, as always, is that things are more complicated than they seem. Water pipe smoking mostly takes place in private residences or in public water pipe cafes. These settings are more private than the street corner that many cigarette users use as their smoking lounge. The act of smoking a water pipe is also quite social, as one does not typically smoke a water pipe alone. The taste of Moselle works in tandem with a more social act in a more private setting to give women and young people in Middle Eastern countries and around the world a tobacco smoking option that seems much more attractive than smoking cigarettes. This may explain why it is that when Middle Eastern women choose to smoke tobacco, they often choose to smoke water pipe with greater frequency than their male counterparts. This is a new face of the tobacco epidemic that has tried to establish legitimacy in the public eye by appealing to impulses to appear safe and to uphold tradition. We need to get the message across Nothing about must sell is safe or traditional. And with that, I'd like to invite up a senior consultant to the World Lung Foundation and original author of the Tobacco Atlas, Ms. Judith Mackay.
We'll try it that way. Thank you very much indeed for the introduction. If I could have my first slide, please. Thank you. When Michael and I did the first Tobacco Atlas in 2002, we were faced with a couple of things. We were faced with very little information on which to be able to even do the graphics for the atlas. But we were faced then with the tobacco industry that was principally their main mechanism of interfering with tobacco control was denial. They were denying the health evidence, they were denying the evidence of active smoking and indeed of second-hand smoke. But in these years, since we did that first atlas, we've seen a sea change. We've seen them change from that denial to what we have called legal challenges. The last atlas was the first one where we started trying to map these legal challenges. And this year, it's even worse. In every single corner of the globe, as we've heard, if a government is trying to do anything effective on tobacco, they face a legal challenge. This is their new tactic, and it will only get worse rather than better. So that health departments and governments are bogged down with having to produce documents, go to court. The budget that should go to tobacco control now is going to fight off some of these legal challenges. But the thing to remember is that with very, very few exceptions, these legal challenges are not successful. They're almost like, the Chinese would say, a paper tiger. The tobacco industry themselves have identified these legal challenges, saying we will continue to use all necessary resources and, where necessary, litigation to actively challenge unreasonable regulatory proposals. So this is what we will see much more of in the future. I'll just give you 3 examples. The first one is from Australia. And in Australia, Jane Halton, the Secretary in the Department of Health and Ageing in Australia, said, "It is fair to say we are being targeted to try and intimidate and or threaten us to withdraw the legislation." That was the legislation on plain packaging. South Africa, we find that BAT has sued the Ministry of Health over Tobacco Products Control Act in 2012. But the court in South Africa ruled, as in fact do most of the courts in the world, that the smoking hazards overruled any interests of smokers. And in fact, they added that South Africa had an obligation under the FCTC to introduce the Tobacco Products Control Act. And going thirdly to Uruguay, I think many of us are familiar with the challenge from Philip Morris on health warnings. 2 challenges under domestic law, which they lost, but under an investment treaty, an ongoing investment treaty with Switzerland. So many of these challenges are still very active, but I do remind you that they are surprisingly unsuccessful in the courts, but they are successful in terms of intimidating countries from taking similar action. And we've seen that, in fact, with the plain packaging that originated in Australia. But the message is that if you are being sued, then clearly you're doing something right. If you're going to be ineffective, the tobacco industry takes no notice of you. But if you're doing something that's going to be effective, you're going to come under the radar screen of the tobacco industry. So let's look at a call for action that we've emphasized in this atlas. We've heard Neil speak about NCDs. And the 2 hallmarks of this new atlas are the incorporation of NCDs and, secondly, celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the Framework Convention. And we know that the tobacco control movement must grow its base of support to achieve ever larger and more ambitious policy and public health successes. And what we've tried to do in the Tobacco Atlas is both to inform but to motivate that kind of action. The second section of the book is really about action, what countries have done, the encouragement for other countries to do better than their neighbors and to take similar action at every opportunity. Looking briefly at the FCTC, we have heard, in fact, most of the morning how almost every person now is covered by the FCTC, and there's relatively few countries that have signed but not ratified. And we heard Vera speak at the plenary just before this plenary, basically saying that her vision for the next 10 years is that that circle is closed and that 100% of all the countries in the world will have become parties to the Framework Convention. At the moment, we've got about 89% of the world's population is covered by the Framework Convention. But if we look at some of the individual issues to the highest standard, we find it much more clustered down between about 10 and 25%. So we have a long way to go to move that bar across to 100% coverage in the world. Just a few key messages from the Atlas. The harm providers must routinely integrate smoking cessation services into TB, HIV, alcohol, and mental health. This is the contribution and the understanding of the importance of the other non-communicable diseases. Products containing nicotine need to be regulated in a manner commensurate with the harm they cause, and data of that, of course, is still coming in. The industry itself, government should not heed the tobacco industry threats of rising illicit trade. Government should take active measures to fight this trade instead by what they usually do in terms of illicit trade. And finally, all countries should develop new tobacco control funding or mechanisms to support tobacco control efforts. Thank you. I'd now like to hand over to Michael Eriksson, my co-author from the very beginning, who will next take the floor and discuss his section.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here in front of friends and colleagues over the years dealing with this common agenda and the progress that we've made and the progress that yet has to be made. At the opening reception yesterday, you heard discussions about why do we call it tobacco control? Why do we allow this product to exist? Why don't we just eradicate the product entirely or eliminate it from society? Very bold statements, very, very important questions. And I think the reality, though, is that we do not eliminate or eradicate tobacco despite the millions of deaths. And the harm accrues to the individual user, but the solutions really are in the domain of the governments that allow tobacco to be sold and marketed and for companies to profit by it. And what we're doing in this session is trying to emphasize the important role that governments must play in regulating tobacco products if they are going to allow them to be sold and for their citizens to consume them. They need to be regulated, and what we're proposing is that there is a regulatory life cycle, that regulations exist from the actual growing of tobacco products to their ultimate disposal. And countries have an obligation to regulate the product in each of the 8 stages along this regulatory life cycle, and that the regulation should be based commensurate with the harm of the product. And that every nation needs to look to see what are they doing in each of these 8 regulatory areas. The first one pertaining to how tobacco products are grown. There's many issues you've already heard about today in terms of pesticides use and deforestation associated with growing and curing tobacco products, but also issues associated with child labor of who's harvesting the tobacco products, as well as green nicotine sickness or green tobacco sickness that's associated with picking tobacco crops and having tobacco leaves that are wet contact the bare skin of growers. So regulations need to begin when the product is being grown. We go now to how the products are manufactured or made, and much regulation is often considered around this stage, around official product regulation of what goes into the product, whether safe manufacturing practices are followed, also what's being added to the cigarettes, particularly when they're being manufactured. When I was at CDC, I received the list of ingredients that were added to tobacco products that had to be kept as trade secrets. And each year, tobacco companies reported adding 599 different ingredients to tobacco and making cigarettes. So the regulation of additives, the content of nicotine in tobacco products is also an appropriate area for the manufacturing regulation. The third area is how the products are packaged and labeled. We've seen probably the most progress in this area since the first Tobacco Atlas in 2002, with the onset of quite visible graphic warnings incorporated into the framework convention language, and then the gold standard perhaps being what was first done at the last World Conference by Australia to have plain packaging or standardized packaging that now has been approved in Ireland and is being considered in other countries as well. We learned last night that Pakistan has approved legislation to have 80% of the label with a graphic warning label. So we're seeing progress that was almost not imaginable in terms of how the product is packaged and labeled. The next area for regulation is marketing, and this is again prominent in the Framework Convention, where advertising, marketing, all types need to be either banned or severely restricted, including price promotions and coupons and discounting, because that's part of the overall effort in marketing. And this is an area that we've again made much progress. We know the association between complete bans on marketing and sponsorship and reduction in consumption of tobacco products. The next area of regulation is explicit tax policies. And again, the one thing we know that as price goes up, consumption goes down. And we have established this for tobacco. We advocated around the world, and now it's being considered for other types of risky behaviors. So your tax policy and how the monies are used that are generated from the tax policies are critically important issues. The next area in this 8th section is how is the product sold? What's the point of purchase environment? What's the minimum age of purchase? Just last week in the United States, the Institute of Medicine recommended the age of 21 for the minimum age of purchase. That's not the law of the land, but that's the recommendation from the most prestigious scientific group. Vending machines need to be banned, and we need to look at how the cigarettes, the point of purchase environment. Next to last in the regulatory area, and one that we sometimes don't think is regulatory but is very important, are the rules and regulations of how the product can be used, under what conditions and where. This is so important because it not only protects non-smokers from exposure to secondhand smoke, but it also changes the social norms and allows for more aggressive and effective tobacco control activities. I was absolutely delighted after observing Abu Dhabi for a few days and the prevalence of shisha smoking, as mentioned by Alex. They learned last night that the city of Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates has banned shisha smoking in the entire city. So it can be done. Norms can change and behaviors can change. And lastly, and something again we tend not to think about, is disposal or the litter. You heard earlier, cigarette butts are the single greatest cause of environmental litter. We have some leaders in the audience today who've advocated to do more around preventing tobacco products from contributing to environmental degradation and litter. And as an example, in San Francisco, they passed a law, a 20-cent user fee on a pack of cigarettes to pay for cleanup and environmental harm that's caused by the use of the product. So there's a variety of regulations that relate to tobacco. We'd like to look at it as a life cycle, and each nation that's in this audience, as you go back to your country, you should look to see what are you doing in these 8 areas, ranging from how tobacco is grown to how it's disposed of. Next, I'd like to invite Michal Stokwoza from the American Cancer Society. He will discuss economic aspects.
We all know that when a nation goes from poverty to prosperity, it makes the entire world stronger and better place to live. But what many of us probably do not fully realize or appreciate is how big impact on economic development have improvements in health. It is estimated that between 2000 and 2011, about 24% of growth in low and middle income countries resulted from health improvements. In sub-Saharan Africa, 69% of economic development resulted from health improvements. Tobacco control is a key factor in improving health. That's why tobacco control plays a key role in economic development. First, it helps to avoid tobacco-related economic costs, the costs to society, just like lost productivity or healthcare costs. We've heard from Jeff before that those costs can be as big as $2 trillion a year. But also, tobacco control helps to earn opportunities, such as when a former smoker decides to invest money that they previously spent on tobacco into their children's education. Tobacco control is a fundamental investment in human capital and investment that directly leads to economic growth. And funders, international funders around the world realize that. Those are the funders that provide development aid and especially health aid to low and middle income countries. They decided to invest some of their budget in tobacco control. But this investment in tobacco control is still relatively small. In all low and middle income countries, there are currently over 4 million people dying from tobacco each year, while the international funding for tobacco control is very, very minimal. Actually, international donors provide 1 US cent per person per year in low and middle income countries for tobacco control. The other 1 cent comes from the governments of those low and middle income countries, the governments that decide to fund programs for tobacco control in their countries. So in total, the funding for tobacco control, the international funding and the domestic public funding is only 2 cents per person per year in low and middle income countries. And actually, both funding sources are very important. The international funding is important, especially for countries at the very early stages of tobacco epidemic, the countries that lack resources, that lack capacity to face the powerful tobacco industry. But the entire idea behind the economics of development is about creating conditions where the international funding is no longer needed, where the domestic funding is sustainable and adequate. And in that respect, tobacco control has a great potential. Governments from low and middle income countries collect over $10 per person per year in tobacco taxes. So they can easily invest more in tobacco control in their own countries. Finally, we know that tobacco control measures, so the tools that we use, are proven to be effective and are actually relatively cheap to implement. WHO estimates that only 11 cents per person is needed to cover all people in low and middle income countries for Best Buy tobacco control measures. 11 cents per person per year, yet we are still far away from this threshold. Well, I hope I convinced you that tobacco control is not only a public health issue, but also an economic development issue. And the entire tobacco atlas is about conveying this and other messages to as broad audience as possible, to an audience of scholars, policymakers, journalists. That's why we created this all-new book and its companion, the tobaccoatlas.org webpage. Through the webpage, you can actually download the entire atlas and its content for free. You can download our graphics and use it in your own presentations. You can download the data behind each graphic and use it in your own analysis. At the tobaccoatlas.org webpage, you can find country-specific fact sheets that you can print out and give to policymakers in your countries. And you can find sources and methodology behind our estimates. The web page is very interactive and it's actually scalable. So you don't only can use it on your computer, but also tablet and smartphone. Finally, the content of the web page is easily shareable, so you can share it on social media. So please go to the tobaccoatlas.org, use it, and share it. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Elif Dagli, medical professor and NGO leader from Turkey, who will lead our question and answer session.
Thank you very much. We have a very limited time. I have got more than a dozen questions through email from the floor and from Twitter. And I had some more in my hand before we came here, sent through emails. So I will try to cluster the questions so that we can run it easier. I've got an industry cluster, an epidemiology cluster, and a development cluster, and a gender cluster in my lab now. So I will start with the industry cluster. I think this will be coming to Judith mainly, and Alex as well. So they have compared the efficiency and innovation of tobacco industry tactics to tobacco control tactics. and they have seen from the Tobacco Atlas that industry looks very good, very different in the 10 years compared in the last 10 years. How does tobacco control innovate and change at the same time? Is there a problem with the microphone? Could I finish all the industry ones so that you can answer all them? And another question is, the Atlas is all, can you hear me? Yes. There is a problem with the microphone, I think. Shall I go there? Okay. Judith and Alex, the question is regarding tobacco industry. How does tobacco industry innovative tactics compare with tobacco control tactics in the same period? Are we efficient as much as tobacco industry? The second question is related with the supply and demand side. Is the Tobacco Atlas, does it cover both sides enough, or is it just demand instead of supply? And another question is regarding water pipe together with tobacco industry. Could it be tobacco industry behind the orchestrated spread of muscle water pipe for Alex, as well as flavored cigarettes, muscle water pipe, and e-cigarettes with flavors coming up at the same time? Is it a coincidence? So this is for tobacco industry section now. Could I have answers from Judith and Alex, please?
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. Are we as innovative as the tobacco industry? We certainly know that the tobacco industry is extremely innovative. It's innovative with its products. It's moving to e-cigarettes. It's innovative in finding new ways and forms of marketing and promotion when one channel is banned for it and allowed for it. They've got some very, very creative people on board in terms of finding new ways to promote their products. There's no doubt about that at all. Are we as innovative? I found that quite a difficult question to answer, but one of the things we have done in this atlas is to look at the future and to look at some novel measures. We've tried to think a bit outside the box. We've tried to be quite daring in some of these suggestions, looking towards the end game. We haven't quite done that in the previous atlases, so this is something fairly new. But I think that the fundamental is that we know already what to do. We know what works. If every country were to actually implement the Framework Convention, for example, we could bring down smoking rates considerably around the world, just doing nothing new at all, if we were just simply to implement it. So I think we have to work jolly hard at that and to try and make sure that we do what we know works. But at the same time, just searching new ways, whether they be, with mobile phones, whether they be looking at a smoke-free generation, all these kinds of things. I think we do have to have a sort of a department almost that really looks to the future and tries to outmatch the creativity of the tobacco industry.
Thank you. Alex, would you like to add?
To answer my question, I guess the one about water pipe, or I certainly agree with Judith that they're incredibly innovative, and muscle flavors are one of those innovations, but I think that the flavored tobacco arose in a market without a lot of brand power, at least in certain circumstances. This is what you were saying with e-cigarettes. It's similar that, for example, we have thousands of e-cigarette brands and nowhere near the same number of cigarette brands. And one of the ways that brands can differentiate themselves in a burgeoning new product is by offering flavors. Now, the Masel tobacco has settled on certain favorite flavors, and apple is particularly by far and away the most popular. But as the market matures, we might see fewer flavors, but not necessarily any less of an emphasis on those flavors. And the industry is smart to take that tactic.
Thank you. A few prevalence questions, especially among the gender issues. And just to remind you that INVAT is celebrating its 25th year with a booklet being spread at this time. Is smoking prevalence lower in men than women in some countries? If so, what is the reason? Who wants to answer that?
No.
Neil?
As far as I know, there is not a country where go ahead.
There's,
There
I
are
think,
two countries?
Vanuatu and Sweden.
Oh, okay, Sweden and Vanuatu. Apologize. Our hearts go out to Vanuatu right now for other reasons, I think. But in general, men smoke at much higher rates than women around the world. There are many countries where women and men smoke at about the same rates. The United States is a country like that. Many European countries, men and women smoke at about the same rates. The interesting regions of the world are places like the Middle East and Asia, where men smoke at much, much, much higher rates than women. And I always thought that there's an opportunity there for women to set a better example for men in a whole variety of ways, in social settings and other things. People know better than I the reason for that tremendous gender difference in smoking rates. It's usually explained as largely a cultural issue where it's sort of socially unacceptable for a woman to smoke. But I think there's an opportunity there that we could take advantage of.
Thank you. The next question is, countries with high roll your own cigarette makes the current way of calculating per capita consumption misleading. Will you agree with that?
I would just suggest that actually all prevalence surveys should include all forms of tobacco, and this is becoming very acute now with the e-cigarettes. I think all international, national and subnational surveys from now on must include questions on the prevalence and the use and the attitude of e-cigarettes. I mean, the Bloomberg financial forecasts are that e-cigarettes will move from less than 1% of the global market to more than 10% in the next 10 years. So we must begin tracking it right away. And I think, you know, including all forms of tobacco, including roll your own and chewing tobacco, are now an essential part of any of the prevalence surveys that we do.
I've got another question for you, Judith. It is, global prevalence of smoking will continue to rise due to China. So when do you see the global tipping point?
Just to clarify, it's not the prevalence that will rise. The global prevalence of smoking is coming down. The problem is because of the population bulge, we are going to move from 7 million to 9 million people by about 2040. There's going to be 2 billion more people in the world. So even if we bring the prevalence down, there's going to be more smokers until almost certainly 2030, 2040. So it's the numbers that are going up. It's not the prevalence. In general, the prevalence is coming down everywhere. And China, of course, is an immensely important point. 1 in every 3 smokers in the world lives in China. 1 in every 3 cigarettes smoked is smoked in China. But China at the moment has reached that tipping point, and I think it points to political will under the current president, Xi Jinping. And since he took over the presidency, I mean, more has happened in China in the last 6 months and practically in the last 20 years in terms of the party school coming on board, advertising and smoke-free ban going through. Beijing will become smoke-free, a better law than almost any country in the world.
It looks promising.
It looks very promising indeed. And even the People's Liberation Army have been given a directive that they shouldn't offer cigarettes and shouldn't smoke. So China now is really just on that tipping point.
Okay. If Mike does not have a point, I carry on.
I was just going to add to Judith's comment, but she elaborated on it nicely, that in my opinion, the biggest change that's occurred since the last World Conference and the last Tobacco Atlas has been the change in progress in China. And we're hopeful and optimistic that that will continue, and it can be one of the most important types of progress that possibly be made. So.
Okay, the last set of questions are about developmental issues and economics. So the question is asking the relation between tobacco growing on food security. The other two questions are mentioning development and environmental issues, gaining them into tobacco control movement, and how can we use the post-2015 agenda process to bring more resources to global tobacco control. So who wants to answer? Miha, will I?
I'll take the first one in terms of the relationship between tobacco growing and food security. Like many of the issues here, it's a complex one. We could look at it in just a simple association that we see now that half of the largest tobacco producers in the world, tobacco leaf producers in the world, also happen to be among the most insecure countries in the world in terms of food security. Now, the relationship is not a linear, perfect one between the two, but it does make you think about how you're allocating your resources, what you're growing and where you're growing it and why. So it is certainly something that we need to look at much more closely and is a genuine concern.
Regarding the development goals and Millennium Development Goals, and actually lack of tobacco control within Millennium Development Goals, there is not much we, the NGO world, can do, but we are certainly very much vocal to try to push it on the post-2015 agenda. And the American Cancer Society took a role in 2011 UN high-level meetings in New York, trying to persuade the diplomats to include tobacco control because it's such an important issue. So we cannot make it happen, but we can help.
Okay. The last two questions. What are the most radical tobacco control solutions did you find? And the last one from the hosting country, what is the most troubling or promising trend for the Middle East and United Arab Emirates? Is it water pipe? Alex?
I wouldn't say that the most troubling trend is water pipe. Well, it could be. I'd say that excise taxes and affordability are a particularly large issue here in the Gulf states in particular. Cigarettes here are the most affordable in the world. That's partially due to the large economic growth that's been seen here, but also due to the fact that prices have not kept up with income growth. And as the countries become wealthier, they need to raise prices, hopefully through taxes, excise taxes in particular, in order to bring affordability down. I'd say that's the biggest future threat to the Gulf states.
Mike?
I think in terms of what we've learned in this atlas that's most significant is the transformation of the tobacco industry in terms of products driven around nicotine delivery and whether public policy is prepared to respond appropriately, whether it's e-cigarettes or snus or shisha or other types of products. And we joke when we were developing this atlas that maybe we should change the name to the Nicotine Atlas instead of the Tobacco Atlas. But the industry is very rapidly transforming to provide alternative methods of nicotine delivery, and policy needs to be nimble and adaptive to that in a way that advances the public health. And I'm not sure we have all the answers in that regard yet, but that's really the dramatic change, in my opinion, in the future challenges that we have.
And perhaps just to say, one of the most encouraging things I found about the Atlas was the concept of this end game, whether it be the WHO targets or whether it be the 5%, as suggested by Robert Beaglehole. The mere fact we can get there, mere fact we're talking about an end game. When Michael and I started these atlases, we never even dreamt we'd be actually speaking about this concept of eradication, this concept of success, this idea we can do it, we can bring this down. And the tobacco industry are on record as saying that smoking prevalence would never go into single figures in any country. And I think that's really a challenge. And the huge advantages of defining an end game, like some countries New Zealand has done, is that everything then, that you have to have a plan. Instead of fighting for a tax increase year by year, if a country announces an end game of, say, 5%, then it has to actually introduce what they're going to do year by year. It commits the government to long-term planning to get it done. And I think that's actually really quite exciting, the idea that we can actually succeed.
With this, I conclude the question and answer session. I would like to thank personally to all the contributors of the Atlas, because it's so exciting and wonderful Atlas, and for all the speakers and John Seffren. Thank you very much.